So I'd like to introduce our panel. You've met Dr. Mark Hernandez, back down there, and Dr. Paul Meechan. Paul, former CDC, former Merck, which is when I met him when I was with the pharmaceutical industry as well. Dr. John LaRochelle, president of Lighthouse, one of our sponsors here this week and a GBAC advocate. Dr. Elizabeth Cowley, or I'm not sure if you're a doctor. I'm not a doctor, but Dr. Elizabeth Cowley, CEO of Poppy. Again, they just received GBAC registration this last week. I'm very pleased. And also a sponsor for this program and advocate. Dr. John McKeon, CEO of Allergy Standards, and they're a partner with GBAC. So I'm very excited to have. Our panel topic is you can't monitor what you can't monitor what you don't measure, and you can't manage what you don't monitor. And it's one of those things that let's look at the importance to understand what it is that we need to monitor and what we need to measure, and then what we can do. It's more important to understand some of these terms and acronyms because it's like we throw a lot of alphabet soup around and we know it. And what something may mean to one person may be totally different to somebody else. So Paul, I know that you've been working on some of this for this very talk, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Patty. So one of the advantages of having a group like this with a disparate set of knowledge and experience is that we're able to combine those expertise and experiences into a common framework and actually expand our knowledge. But part of the problem is, of course, in trying to generate a framework, and that was part of the discussion John started last night, was you have to have a common vocabulary. And Mark, thank you for leading into this, because he gave a series of terms that, mercifully, you left undefined, so I could actually have that discussion this morning. Without that common vocabulary, we're going to be unable to come to a common framework. So the idea was, in the next couple of seconds, go through a number of definitions for key terms that we'll be using in this discussion for this hour. So we're actually talking from a common basis of understanding. So I wanted to start with, and these are in no particular order, is TVOC, the total volatile organic compounds. For those that are not familiar with the vocabulary, this is what that lesson is. It's going to be the sum of everything in terms of parts per million or micrograms per cubic meter. And that should be defined when you're talking about it, so people understand the number. Because if you use ppm versus microgram per cubic meter, and nobody's understanding which one you're talking about, you'll come up with different answers. But it's the sum for all organic molecules. They can be released from paints, glues, carpets, we have in front of us, etc., remobilized by people's movement. One thing to keep in mind, and there was a discussion of a question near at the end of the talk, Mark's talk, it was a question about measuring VOCs. In terms of looking at biologicals, as part of the Air Considerations, this actually came together over what was originally a COVID discussion. VOCs have little to do with it. They are vapors. They're not going to be carrying biologicals. They may carry some fragments, but they're not actually going to track necessarily. They will not necessarily track with organisms. So we want to be careful about that. We may be talking about things like threshold value limits, permissible exposure limits, or recommended exposure limits. TLVs, PELs, or RELs. PELs are regulatory in the US, RELs and TLVs are not. They're only recommendations. So if you're throwing out those numbers, understand that they may be regulatory, they may not be. And they may be, if they're regulatory, they may be significantly out of date. They may have been done in the 1970s, and 50 years later, they haven't been updated. Mark mentioned PMs, particulate matter. They're usually given a sub-designation, and you saw that. Mark was talking about PM 2.5, although he didn't actually say the number 2.5. That is the size in microns. And so you've got an illustration on the slide that shows the size of a PM 2.5 relative to the size of a human hair. So it gives us some sort of sense of scale that we're talking about. The key reason that we're talking about PM 2.5 is their ability to be deposited in the deep lung. And therefore, if that is carrying either a hazardous molecule or a biological organism, you have the ability for that to be deposited within the lungs. And clearance is relatively slow, if done at all. Excuse me for reaching over. Mark mentioned bioaerosols. They're a subcomponent of aerosols that are comprised not only of a matrix, but will contain a biological organism in it. They may be alive or dead. And as Mark was showing, the difference between what he was recovering in terms of RNA sequences when he was doing the coronavirus work versus those that he's getting in what we call the TCID50s or the live virus were significantly different. So in looking at a bioaerosol, if you're simply looking at genomics, you may get a different answer, and a much higher answer than you would get when you're looking at the live fraction, the actual ability to recover virus that's viable. So, and as he was talking about, he was mentioning that it's a biological organism. A subcategory of that is going to be a pathogen. And for those that are not the biologists, a pathogen is going to be an organism that is capable of causing disease. Not all organisms do. Many of them are commensals. Many of them we rely on to provide us essential amino acids and vitamins, but some are capable of causing disease, and that's really the ones that we want to be focusing on when we're looking at bioaerosols. Mark mentioned air changes per hour. The classic definition of air change per hour is fresh outside air. The number of replacements per unit volume or per space over an hour. There is now an equivalent air change per hour, ACHE, Mark also referenced that now blends the ability to use outside air as well as purified indoor air that's being recirculated as a replacement, but a recognition that cleaned air that is been purified may be inadequate, maybe actually be a superior replacement to outdoor ventilation, because you may not be able to, as Mark mentioned, may not be able to generate sufficient outdoor air to fill spaces like this.
Okay.
Oh, one last start. I want to just remind everybody, in looking at the Denver schools, Mark is talking about HEPA filtration. I want to remind people that the definition, at least the US DOE definition of a HEPA filter, has a minimum efficiency at 0.2 to 0.3 microns. Above and below that, especially below that, it's more efficient. So don't think of it as a continuous drop as high as decreases. There's actually a rebound effect due to Brownian motion. And so when we're looking at particle attenuation through a HEPA filter, that when we start getting down to the size of actual viral particles, you may actually be more efficient than the minimum 99.97% that's the DOE's specification for a HEPA filter. And I think I can now turn that back to you, Patty.
All right, thank you. So let's talk about some real world cases. You know, what does it look like in the real world? Elizabeth, Mark, I'm going to turn this to you. We look at schools. What are schools? I know that they're a special category, but what other types of buildings are there? Elizabeth?
It'd be my pleasure. What we're finding right now is it's really affordable to actually have data. First of all, congratulations to all of you who are making decisions based on data. Well done. That is a wonderful start. And it's really easy to get more specific data, more useful data on a real-time basis or a more real-time basis than you probably know right now. And that's whether you're a school or a royal palace, I won't say which one, but we've got one that's under constant monitoring and everything in between. And this is the kind of data that is not only about what's traditionally covered in indoor air quality, we've been talking a lot about those, but also on a couple of other different dimensions. So other useful dimensions we find for folks, regardless of the kinds of space they're in, are, for example, information about specificity. So what specific organism is in your space and how prevalent is it? Spatial data, how does it move within that space? We were talking a little bit earlier, thank you, Dr. Hernandez, about the mythical perfectly mixed room, which doesn't exist. So movement actually matters, and you can measure and monitor that as well in real time. And then the ability to also be able to have data that talks about, that includes lots of different measurements over time. So longitudinal data, and you can take a different reading in a room in the morning versus the afternoon with exactly the same HVAC settings and the exact same occupancy level. And it changes the airflow pattern and especially how the way the viruses move in that spaces. Small currents, small different changes actually matter. So again, regardless of the type of space, you can actually see that kind of data now and add that to measurements of how many particulate matters of this size, how many of those are biological, what's the CO2 in the room. So I think a picture's worth 1,000 words, but these are the kinds of maps that now can be drawn. In real time, not using computer models, but using actual data measured in the space. Every single one of these arrows represents a simulated pathogen, airborne pathogen based in human breath that is going from one part of a 3-story building here to another part of a 3-story building. And if you do this in a specific way, you can actually count how many of the particles that say were released from that side of the room reach here, reach there, reach over there. And you can do that in real time. And so then what you can do when you can count, not only see this over a time and space, but you can then raise to the surface which ones are actually concerning. So Dr. Hernandez, you were mentioning this morning, cross-room contamination. So the ability, what's going on in one classroom to affect what's going on in the classroom next to it. A lot of these arrows that are depicted here from an office building that's being monitored, showing that it can travel across floors, under doors, around corners. We see this every single day. We see 50-meter patterns often from particles that are coming from people's breath. But the ones you really want to spend time on and spend all those intervention methods we've been starting to talk about are the ones that are strong currents, like the darker arrows here, where if you've got no budget in a school, which we do a lot of, you can decide where is the right place to put a HEPA purifier, a $200 HEPA purifier. At the same time, you can use the same data in order to help justify decisions made in a $10 million budget to outfit a trading room floor in Midtown Manhattan, who are doing lots of different things using lots of different technologies. And again, continuous data, you can then measure how effective it is under lots and lots of different conditions, lots of different occupancy levels. So it really is useful, this kind of data, in all sorts of different kinds of spaces.
Thank you. So Mark, can you continue the discussion on some other real-world examples?
Sure, if you give a professor a microphone, you won't shut us up. So yeah, I can do that. Other spaces that, I think I give a laundry list up there. There are spaces we want to be in, we can choose to be in. There are spaces that we have to be in, we can't choose to be in because we have to work and make a living. And then there are other spaces that some people don't have a choice to be in. And my kids complain that their high school is a prison. They have to go there. They don't have a choice to be there. They don't have a choice about the air quality that they breathe there. They right now have a choice to wear a mask or not, so that's schools, but I also have a son in the military. He lives in a very crowded barrack. He doesn't have a choice to be there. He signed a contract for 10 years to be in the military, and he doesn't have a choice of who he cohabitates with, when he's with them, and so on. So I think that there are military situations. We're seeing more and more of that. Our military moves around a lot. Other militaries move around a lot, and they're in temporary and semi-permanent housing, as are their families. So my son now lives at Fort Rucker, Alabama, and him and his peers and their families don't have a choice about where they live there, what their surroundings are, unless they choose to live off base, which a lot of them can't do or can't afford. So I think that there's military constructs. I introduced homeless shelters in the end of my presentation. We have a growing homeless population, and they don't have a choice about where they live, where they inhabit. When the weather gets bad, they have to go inside or they die. And that, when it gets very hot or very cold, which it does in Colorado, and there are many parts of the country and world where you live, people have to go inside, and they have to go inside in high density. There's incarceration, and I've been in this situation as well. I don't want to be in a hospital waiting room, but I'm there because I brought somebody in that's harmed, whether it be my students or those in my family. I have to go and sit in a hospital waiting room for a long period of time. So there are, those types, so many, we can go into so many things. The ones we have choices of, okay, I can go to a nice cafe here on Michigan Ave. I chose to sit outside, a lot of people chose not to. So there's places that we have choices about. We want to be that are part of our economy, cafes, restaurants, gyms, things to keep us healthy, that in inclement weather we have to go in, if you want to exercise, you got to go inside in a lot of parts of the country. So some of it's luxury and choice, some of it's not. And a lot of us, and I'm one of them, I don't have a choice about where I teach. I teach in a big classroom packed full of kids wanting to learn, or paying to learn thermodynamics and applied microbiology and so on. I'm an engineer, and I teach a lot of students at the same time a lot of the time. I don't have a choice about that, and they don't either if they want to be trained. Some of that's gone online, it's coming back, and I'm in a big public state university, I have to teach inside, in person, period. So I think, did I give a good laundry list of other environments? What am I missing, other than healthcare?
I mean, it's very interesting. I don't think there's an industry out there that doesn't get touched by this. I mean, this hotel, restaurants, daycares, I mean, you name it. Convention centers, we do a lot with working with trade shows and convention centers, and a lot of people thought in the very beginning that they were going to be the super spreader event. I will be one of the first to say that some of the convention centers and the conventions that we worked with in the very beginning, they did not want to be on the front page to be a super spreader event, so they put in place mitigation strategies. They may not have been able to deal with the air at the time, but they put those other strategies in with masking and social distancing and hand hygiene, and there were some very successful convention centers. We're finding that museums, you want to go to a museum, what are you going to do in a museum? I don't see him here yet, but talking about art galleries. And it was one of those things where they were thinking about doing certain things. I said, you know what, you might want to look at air filtration, not something where you're spraying something on the art, from that standpoint. And there are a lot of different mitigation strategies, and I don't think that there's what we call vertical that is missed. And I think that's one of the things that the pandemic pointed out. One other question in kind of this area is, how often should we be monitoring? And is there in the biosafety world, we always used to say, well, it depends. I mean, if you never go into a building and there's only a couple people, you don't necessarily have to monitor as much as if you're in a classroom, for example. Is there a guideline that you think of when you look at that? And I think I know the answer to this, but I want to hear from you guys.
I'm happy to jump in there. I think we've gotten to the point, fortunately through technology, that you can have pretty much continuous measurement without a lot of expense. What we're all driving for, just to say it out loud, is self-healing buildings. We want a continuous flow of reliable measurement of the most important things that are affecting human health, and then we want that to be integrated into the systems that have the ability to adjust how that building performs. And so a lot of buildings aren't that sophisticated yet. The data is starting to become available, but that's not widespread. It will become over the next few years. But that's what we're shooting for. Often when we're talking to folks, it's saying, how often do you want to take action on the data that you're given? And that is really when that helps determine the intervals in the meantime. Before it can be completely automated. If we showed you data every minute, would you take changes every minute? No, probably not, unless it was automated. If we brought to your attention that something abnormal was going on, that something is incredibly high, we've actually detected COVID in the 3rd floor boardroom, and there's a big meeting coming up because we're plugged into the calendar schedule for that building. Would you take action? You probably would take action on that. So we're finding it's weekly in some cases, it's quarterly in some cases, it's event-driven in other cases. So we're going to be doing a big HVAC rehaul. A lot of the schools, we help them with a bunch of data at the beginning or at the end of the school year. They've done a lot of work over the summer. We're going to go back in and help them in the fall to show them how well those things have happened. So for me, the biggest question is, how often are we going to use the data? And then can we use something abnormal going on, an alert-based method for anything that happens in between those periods.
Thank you. So facility managers, what are important tips for a facility manager? And I'm going to look at John Larshall here, president of Lighthouse, but he used to be a facility manager. And I learned that when I went to dinner with him one night, several months ago. And I think one of the things that we've learned is, in the past, when I was an EHS head, it was one of those things that I see what's available today. And it's like, I wish we would have had some of these things. And I'm sure that that's probably a common thing. So John, could you talk about what facility managers could use?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of challenges. The most fundamental thing to look back at is, the technology innovations have changed. We now have the ability to understand what's going on in our environment. When you look at this room, is it safe? Is it safe to occupy? What's in the air? What are we breathing? And in any environment that we're in, what's going on? So, the whole theme of this is, you can't manage what you don't understand. We have to get to real monitoring, both situationally, can be a snapshot in time, but more importantly, continuous monitoring and really understanding your entire environment. Facilities managers, we deal with varying buildings and age and infrastructure. So you may have buildings that are 150 years old or 100 years old that has no HVAC. My group works with a lot of the prisons, so a lot of them, their HVAC system is literally opening a window. So really understanding what's going on, what is the ebb and flow of the building, what are the other impact points that are affecting indoor air quality, such as cleaning and disinfection. We know in a peer-reviewed study from Dr. Curtis Donsky that floors are a major contributing factor to raising the risk of microbes getting from that floor into the air and then onto the surfaces and onto the population within the building. So in most facilities, even hospitals, high 80 to 90% don't even disinfect their floors on a daily basis. So understanding what is going on with cleaning and disinfection, what kind of vacuum cleaners you're using HEPA filters, you're using burnishers that are spinning 1,500 RPMs a minute. Where do you think that air is going? It's absolutely getting in the air. So the one thing I've learned through, working with, understanding air monitoring is, you have different time cycles in your building. Whether it be an elementary school where the students are coming in, then you have after-school activities, whether it be an office building, understanding how these levels are changing on an hourly and daily basis and really coming up with a true air management plan. And without monitoring, without a comprehensive assessment, we're really taking a guess on what's going on in our environment. So from a facility standpoint, you really, I relate it back to surgery. I had major shoulder surgery. I didn't let the doctor go in there and just start, cutting it open and fishing around. They did x-rays, they did ultrasound, they did MRI, they did blood work to best understand what the treatment plan is. The same thing in the facilities. We need to understand all of our spaces to understand what's going on, what's in it, and what's not. Put your management focus and your resources on where your true problems are. We work with a lot of hospitals, and the ORs may be great, but the core area air could be contaminated. And we have found that a lot of the ancillary areas where people aren't focusing on these critical care environments are the problematic areas. And as doors open, and as people and equipment moves, so does the air, and it kind of interchanges. So just better information. It's great to see the new technology. I highly encourage you to spend some time with the vendors that are here, because the technology is giving us powerful information to make a difference. So.
Thank you. And that really does set up for Dr. John McEwen. This is pretty awesome. We have some myths that are out there, and then actually knowing what works. From allergy standards standpoint, it really does have an impact on our health, our wellness. And I'll turn this over to you.
Thanks, Patty, and congratulations on your conference. You are a good chess player. Some really good, wonderful thought leadership talks this morning. Masterclass by Mark this morning on sensor technology. I think he's actually covered most of my points. When you said, John, when you talk about facilities, I got a bit worried because I know nothing about facilities. So I'm an ER doc by training, and I'm speaking after lunch. So I might try and bring it back from the clinician or the parent of a kid with asthma and allergies, bring it back a little bit, because it's the title of talk is you can't manage what you don't measure, and that's absolutely right. But just as the speakers have said this morning, you then have to apply, you have to have a plan and take action. It's actionable insights. Knowledge without actionable insights isn't going to have an impact. We say in medicine, what gets assessed, what gets addressed is a different way of saying it. And I'd like to kind of pivot what we're talking about to patients getting their own data. Mark spoke about people bringing carbon dioxide monitors and things like that. And he also spoke about a car dashboard. Although that was a great metaphor. If you were to buy a brand new Tesla car, a couple $100,000, you wouldn't get that serviced by a pretty shabby mechanic. You'd bring that to somebody who really knows about how to service a Tesla. But we don't bring our buildings, we don't have that same attitude. So we do it for car, but we don't do it for buildings. Or we can do better in buildings, and that's a great metaphor. And in medicine we say, look, if you kind of half take a history of a patient, if you half investigate them, half diagnose them, you should only expect them half to get better, only half expect them to get better. So it's all about data. John, you just mentioned there about surgeons. If somebody's flying you from New York to LA, he has his instruments the whole time, he's checking in, he's pivoting, he's adjusting. You mentioned about how often should we actually feedback, I don't mind this, but all the time. From my point of view as a clinician, I think patients now are going to start looking for this data, parents in schools, all the places that Mark was talking about. And they will challenge the building owners, the building operators, the facility managers, people, what are you doing? We heard a lot this morning about purpose-driven organizations. And the other thing you can measure is the bottom line, but you can measure the triple bottom line, which is what are you doing for people, your purpose, and obviously your profit. And I think it will be much more profitable. It'll be good business, energy management. We've heard about sensor technology today. We've heard about smart sensors. Everything will be connected. I think one of the speakers spoke about Internet of Things last night. Anything in a building can be measured. We'll have a measure, we'll have a sensor. That sensor will be connected, it will be smart, and somebody will be getting feedback loops and action plans on that. In medicine, we talk about two different things. We talk about declared data and actual use data. So declared data is the doctor asks you, how much exercise did you do last week? You go, I went for a 5K run, a 10K run. Use data is, okay, well, hand me over your iWatch or whatever it is you have, and let's see how many steps you did actually take. And that's what it's going to be like in buildings. We can have declared data, we can have aspirations what we're doing, but somebody will actually start to audit the use data of what's actually going on in that building. So they're just kind of some of the aspects of what's been spoken about this morning from a clinician point of view, and I think what not only patients and people who have respiratory illness and are more air aware, but the general population will be looking for.
So, are there any other thoughts from the panel before we open it up for questions?
Yeah, I want to bring in what he actually want to fuse Elizabeth's comment and the last one. And we flirted with this, brought it up a little bit yesterday, and that's about energy. So we're really good about monitoring energy, right? Because we got to pay that energy bill in our buildings, and everybody's very conscious of that. And there's no reason that the cartoon that Elizabeth just put up, the monitoring of air quality and the juxtaposition of the energy to get there can't be measured together and optimized. And I think what we might find with the array of technologies up there is we can quickly hone in on what's the most optimal situation to optimize air quality along with our energy bills. And that's, if we're just surfing on air quality data, we're going to miss that. I think at least the building managers that I've run into in the school districts that I've worked in, they're afraid of that. And until you do the math and show them, hey, it's a textbook cost per kid to do this, we can do the same thing with hotels and all the other places that we showed that this is affordable and so on. We need the data to do it. The reason I said continuous is we breathe continuously. We're not in buildings continuously. But then if we have continuous data, we can choose the critical timeframes to make the decisions to do that affordably. So I think Elizabeth nailed that pretty much. But if we don't have the data all the time, we don't know what's normal and what's not, what's a threat and what's not, what's affordable and what's not. So I say get the data, get it all the time, and choose when the critical timeframes to make decisions out of that data are. And do it in concert with energy, because that's where the money is.
So we can open up for questions. Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. So you guys are monitoring measurement experts, okay? My question is, it seems to me that we typically use CO2 to measure occupancy-related stuff, right? And my question is, have you guys looked at comparing the use of that data to just using occupancy sensors to help us identify, how many people are in a room? Because from a cleaning perspective, that's often what can help us drive where we focus our resources. Or do you believe that using CO2 as an indicator of occupancy is a better way for health or other reasons to do that?
CO2 is a proxy for ventilation performance with a lot of assumptions behind it for a given occupancy. Occupancy alone is not okay. CO2 alone is not okay. PM alone is not okay. We need it all together. Identity, distribution, abundance, and activity. So, Elizabeth, I see her pulling the microphone, so I'm going to defer to you because I think she's going to drill down into this a little bit.
No, I entirely agree. We've paired data that we're generating with occupancy. They're $10, they're cheap. Stick them on the wall. They're really accurate. They're accurate enough for the purposes, and then you don't necessarily have to also deal with the assumptions behind CO2. Those CO2 is also a good measure for our pure math. So a lot of what we're doing now, because we've been talking about education, is what's a simple way of presenting this to occupants? And I would love feedback. If anybody wants to come by, I want to show you what we're thinking of. A lot of it's based on the simplification, same calculations in the background of a lot of the common calculators that are out there from MIT and other organizations, but in a way that non-scientists can understand, and that's about occupancy guidelines, right? And again, a lot of organizations have been driving to that, but if you know how many people are in a space, you know what they're typically doing in that space, are they singing, are they sitting, etc. And you have the data about how well the air is being cleared from that space in all the ways that we've talked about, then you can actually give people, here's an occupancy guideline with actual occupancy count. It's safe to use this space, statistically speaking, for this amount of time because of all the other assumptions that have been built into that model. So for our preference for customers is always to just use a pure occupancy sensor, given just how ubiquitous they've become.
Yeah, and I think, to elaborate on that a little bit, from an occupancy standpoint, I'll give you an example that we've seen out in the field here recently with some of our accredited airports. They have occupancy sensors of when people are going into the bathrooms. And that's a really good indication of things like, if they're having so many people going into the bathrooms, they know that their paper towels are going to be, needed to be refilled, this and that. But when you start looking at the ventilation, as Mark indicated, and other attributes, health-wise, that's not necessarily, one airport is not designed the same as the next airport. And so getting to some of that data to understand, understanding the whole picture, knowing that if you have occupancy, those levels are going to go up, and that a school is the same way. Not all schools are designed the same. and their ventilation systems are not all designed the same. Their cleaning schedules may not all be the same, but when you start to know your facility from a facility manager standpoint and having this data, it helps you then be able to put in place programs that actually make a difference. Next question? Yes.
My question is like way over here. I know that we're talking in a silo about monitoring. However, at what point does some of this monitoring bite us in the bottom? I mean, at some point, if we have identified this is something wrong in this building, and it's going to take us 6 months to correct that, if that information gets out somehow, I mean, how can that, but how does that liability come back as a bad thing? I really don't know how to ask the question, but I've been involved in an aspergillus case where we knew we had an aspergillus case. It took us 4 months to figure it out where it was and all that stuff. How do we keep that information from getting out there and to our detriment?
Quit looking at me.
Well, two former EHS directors here.
The first one was, and then you can jump in if I'm wrong, keeping it quiet is probably a bad legal strategy.
Yeah.
And having been on the losing end of several of those sorts of discussions, acknowledging that there's an issue is your first step in reducing your liability. And then coming up with a time frame for remediating it is also a useful strategy. In terms of, I think, a lot of the measurements that we've been talking about, I don't think we have, unless you get to a permissible exposure level, like for CO2, you don't necessarily have a level at which you say, oh my God, we're in trouble. Correct me if I'm wrong, panelists. There's good and not so good. So at this point, with the technologies available, and again, please correct me, colleagues, I don't think those sensors are going to give you something that you're going to go, or somebody's going to observe and go, oh my God, we're in legal trouble. I think what it does is that we have an opportunity to do better, and it gives you an opportunity to prove that your building is an advantage in terms of keeping your staff healthy. But I don't think you're in the opposite at this point with the technologies that are available.
To elaborate on that a little bit, if I'm, earlier somebody asked about here in the United States, OSHA standards and where we're at. We do not have an infectious disease OSHA standard. And to elaborate on that even a little, Paul actually, before the pandemic, worked with OSHA from a CDC standpoint on what that might look like. And from my standpoint, being, in virus management, managing these EHS programs, I was like, I don't need another standard out there to tell me that I need to do something at some point. There's enough out there, but on the other hand, I knew that there was an issue. I am waiting for the first case of somebody to say, you didn't do anything. You're not monitoring, and we know there's a problem. You're not putting in place programs, and underneath the general duty clause, I want to have a complaint. I know that there have been some already, but now that we are moving into a different phase of litigation potential, you are going to see some people saying, you did not put in place programs to help ensure the health and safety of me coming back to work and working in these situations, or civil cases of those people that have to go back to situations like kids in schools and that. That being said, I agree with Paul. If you don't do something, I think you're at a more liable situation than if you do something. If you do something and realize we have an issue, you at least have the opportunity to communicate to people, we're looking into this, we don't know maybe the answer yet, because sometimes it takes a little bit of time. And if there is a problem, let's say it's a Legionella issue or something like that, you can mitigate that by saying, okay, we need to move you out of this situation. And I've had one sick building syndrome issue that we had to go through some of that. So yeah, I think that long term, if I was your EHS VP, I would be sitting there going, we need to do something, and we need to make sure that we're transparent with our people, and you have a better leg to stand on legally than if you don't.
Maybe as a follow-on to that question, if you think about, if you think about kind of what's happened over time and look at like for example, the Clean Water Act, so it's a little more shifting to policy. And you see that has started to regulate the number of contaminants and contaminant reduction that is being put into the water stream and waterways. And you start to think about, we have something that's for a Clean Air Act on the outside. Do you foresee that monitoring and measurement will start to lead as a first step to potential changes and actual policy change to drive kind of an improvement on VOCs, particulates, and things that buildings will have to do?
Yes.
In our lifetime, or?
Yes. And other countries are doing it, right? Other developed countries, and not as fortunate to have our economy. And so that's happening, but it is happening here with our own EPA. And we do have a Clean Air Act, as you mentioned. It's outdoors, but EPA is also charged with looking at indoor air. There is a group within EPA that systematically is going through this, and they're driven, as we were with outdoor air, PM 2.5, PM 10, ozone. Those air quality index components are based on epidemiological outcomes for one, above background health risk, which is for cancer, 1 in a million. If we look at ER visits, if we look at asthma cases and so on, that's coming indoors. In our lifetime, yes, absolutely, right? And we're talking about handfuls of years. The government moves slower than you guys in the private sector, but ORD and the policy people within EPA are working on this right now. And the forecast I have is 24 months right now. But if it's going to be based on health outcomes indoors, that's that's a level of epidemiology that's you need a lot of observations. How do you get observations? Data. So we're in handfuls of years of what I'm told, hopefully in our lifetimes.
Can I kind of go back to the aspergillosis case? You need to check with the American situation. Certainly in Europe, sometimes that would be a reportable disease by the clinician. So if it's picked up, the clinician has to report it. Certainly Legionella and things like that. And I'd emphasize what Paddy said there about ignorance being no defense and employer's liability. There's been changes there. And it may be a good idea to get a legal expert, particularly on this area. But even as what Mark was just saying there, legislation and government will move. There's a feedback loop of voluntary codes, voluntary standards, and they are actually pushing legislation, and the government and the interactive between saying fit well, and the lead folks and Davos and people like that are then influencing. Even you'll see it on my slide later on, the Security and Exchange Commission now looking at building inspection, things like that. So I think we need to get ahead of it. There's being defensive and legal and medical, and that's all fine, that needs to be done. But if we're going to take a leadership position, and this symposium convention is about leadership and thought leadership, is we need to be transparent, energy aligning ourselves, and energy audit sounds pretty dull, but if you have a healthy building checkup, I don't like the aspect of buildings breathe, because they don't, but they are integrated systems. And if we need energy audit and healthy building audits, and then we have accountability and transparency, if people are going to come back from working from home and say, well, why do I need to go into the office for critical things like innovation and where we as human beings need to be together? If you're going to convince people, and they can go to other companies, but they want to come to your company, you will need to have an audit of how healthy your building is. So I'm not saying you're doing this, but that kind of the culture that we could get away with these things and cover them up. Sensor technology is going to blow that all out. And then people will get on social media and they'll exchange it, best places to work and all those, and that will actually drive behavior change. And it kind of goes back to the point about CO2 monitors. There's a lot of debate about it, but you're all technical specialists in this area, but we don't want to lose the dressing room. Well, buildings and dwellings are about people that go into those buildings. So if we have an opportunity to have a permission-based, data-driven conversation, by them having either your technologies or their own technologies, we're beginning to have that dialogue, which I think is going to be good for people in those buildings.
Any other questions? Yes, Gary.
I have just a short comment to what Tricia was touching. Unfortunately, yes, we want to be ahead of all the industries, but the real life situation is that we have faced the project and we have faced the situation that the test results after the few months projects were so bad for the customer that they said, okay, we're not going to share it with you, and we're definitely not going to let you use it public. So that's the thing we have to overcome in a real life business situations. You know, it's a little bit different from the academic point of view, and you know, us as professionals, and we know that you know, we shouldn't dig it deep and cover it with tons of sand. But that's the reality, what's happening. You know, people all of a sudden say, hey, this is bad, and they know it's bad, because there are you know, norms and everything. So that's just a comment, and I agree with what Dr. McKeown just said, that you know, we should start working with all these well, fit well, and BREEAM organizations, because these people who are certified, and these buildings with those buildings which are certified, you know, they are the front leaders, and of course, you know, that's how it goes. But the reality, in a real time, and I'm speaking for European markets, I mean, it's different. If they see how bad it is, first thing they do, okay, well, let me wait when somebody else is solving it, and until they force me to do this, maybe I can get away, you know. And so that's the comment. And one question to Dr. Hernandez. You were saying about the energy savings with the HVAC systems, and we know that the HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, it costs a hell of the money. You know, it's 65% of the total maintenance cost of the building. Did your school project prove, or did you have the results of the energy savings once you have implemented the air purification into the building, into the rooms? And because of that, you could tell them, listen guys, reduce the HVAC exchange rates, reduce, and this is the outcome of the energy savings. Was it a part of your project?
Yeah, we're doing that. Great question. We're doing that economic analysis right now. So keep in mind, this was protect the kids who are unvaccinated that have to go back to school, right? Now with what we have off the shelf, with somebody else's money, right, with philanthropy. So what we did find was exactly what you just said. There were some buildings that were way overventilated, right? That they were spending, they didn't know where they were on the map of how much are they spending to heat, cool, and comfort, just to even make those metrics. So there was a percent of those buildings that we didn't even bother putting in, adding, what was my point here? Effective ventilation. I think we put the little E, mitigation, because we could even say, hey, let's take the money that you're overspending and put that where the building is less performing. So that naturally came out of that analysis. We're actually doing that right now. As a matter of fact, and Patty brought up this, one of the members is NAGA, National Air Cleaners Association. What's the energy benefit of building hygiene in the ventilation system? What's the ROI? When you clean the system, how much bounce do you get back? We could take the same approach, and Elizabeth had that very nice cartoon of, we can use data-driven analysis to optimize, there it is, optimize the placement of HEPA filters or other technology that will allow us to back off if we're overspending on comfort, ventilation, and so on. Having that information helps us to optimize all things, air quality and energy together, all data-driven. And getting the data costs money, but I think it's a lot cheaper than we thought it was going to be. Yeah. So your question's very well taken. The gross answer was, you know, some of those classrooms had 12, 15, 18 air exchanges. They were just blowing air through there. And that didn't help anybody. So back off on that, spend that money elsewhere.
I'll just quickly add, we're finding that in commercial buildings, we're finding that in airports. We, sometimes we'll going and using the CDC safe dose levels, calculate that there's certain parts of buildings that we're monitoring where people can spend 1 million minutes and be safe. So there are definitely places that in regular buildings that are being way over ventilated. And so the money that they're saving from that is going into making other buildings or other parts of their, within their organization a lot safer. And the facility managers are like, finally, I feel like I've been doing everything. I feel like I've been, putting, making the case for a whole bunch of interventions. And now I know exactly where I can actually pull back and still be safe. And then times of surge or anything else, I can actually crank it up again, but not have that as a permanent on state. It's not every building, but we're certainly seeing it maybe even 15, 20% of the time right now.
A question on the PMs, because it's been talked about a lot. Is there a particular size that needs to be monitored and then remediated? I know on the definition that you had shown up there, you had it under 0.3, down to 0.1. So I'm just curious if that's when you're monitoring and remediating, is that something you should take into consideration? Because there is the 2.5 and the 10s, which will help with your allergies, but just curious on if there's a size that you're recommending or focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, if you can breathe it, it's in play, right? So PM10, so we break it up, of course, PM10, fine, PM2.5. This is aerodynamic diameter. The smaller, the deeper penetration potential in your lungs. Ultrafine, very small stuff, right? So I think the rule is, if you can breathe it, it's in play for inactivation, if it's infectious, and or removal if it's not allergenic and so on. So I think those numbers are, and that's just physics, right? So if it's small enough to respire it, and we can measure it, now we can actually measure it pretty quickly, and not quickly, we can measure that in real time. That's been around for a while. It's the biological fraction measurements that you had asked about before that we couldn't do. But quick answer is, if you can breathe it, it's in play for mitigation.
I think some of that comes then, some of the miscommunication out there, because there's a lot of filtration on the market, filters on the market, MERV ratings out there, to not understand what level that can go to, right? So to be able to just get out 2.5 could be misleading.
It is misleading. But when you get into medicine and you start getting into these fineries about how deep something penetrates, or the potential for something to penetrate, the smaller, the deeper, the more trouble you're going to potentially get with it. I mean, once it crosses here, we don't want it anyways, right? So it's 10 and below. Bigger stuff settles quicker, but we still need to clean and pay attention to that. Having the data helps us make decisions about that and which technology to use in which situation. So I think size discriminating data is very important.
So we have time for one more question. If not, you are break for
Ryan,
lunch.
do you have a question?
Oh, wait, is there a question?
I thought she actually, her staff doesn't, they all service us with questions, and I didn't know if you guys had questions. Sydney, come on, now's your chance. No?
Well, while I have you guys here, I want to thank Renata, Katrina,
Yes,
and
thank you.
Sydney. Part of the ISSA that you guys have been doing an awesome job. And then Melissa Wernersbach, who also helped coordinate, she wasn't able to be here with us today. But really want to thank you guys for all the work that you've done.